So in the previous video, we discussed the causes in what began World War I, and in this video, we are going to talk about the consequences. Now, after the World War I happened, we all know that the Triple Entente won. So, this was France, Russia, Britain, and US were joined in way later. At the end of World War I, they decided to create a Treaty of Versailles, which was basically a peace treaty that they created to make sure World War II did not happen. However, ironically, it was the Treaty of Versailles that kind of led to World War II happening. Now, the Treaty of Versailles had quite a lot of terms that they discussed, but an easy way to remember that is again through an acronym, which is BRAT, BRAT. Blame, you have reparations, you have army, and territory. This was basically all of which that is related to Germany, because after World War I ended, Germany had to take responsibility. In fact, one of the very first terms of the Treaty of Versailles was it had something known as, let me add that here, it had something known as the War Guilt Clause, under which Germany had to claim total responsibility for starting the war. Whereas, as you remember, it wasn't Germany that started the war, it was Austria-Hungary and Siberia. And Russia was the one that actually came in first, and then Germany entered the war. So this was technically clearly unfair and led to resentment, which eventually led to World War II, as we will discuss in another video probably. The second point obviously was reparations. Now, reparations came again all to Germany. So Germany was required to pay damages for what was known as wartime destruction, under which the Allied power, the winners, the Entente, also known as the Allied powers, would decide what amount and what sum of money in reparations they would have to pay. So this was again very unfair, because Austria-Hungary did not have to face this. It was all Germany. Then you had territory. Now, Germany had to cede quite a lot of its territory to France, Poland. So this went to France, Poland, Czechoslovakia. At that point was one. So Czechoslovakia, Belgium, Denmark, etc., etc. Basically, they had to cede quite a lot of territory that they had owned. Then you had army. There were quite a lot of military restrictions put on Germany to make sure they couldn't rise up. Again, at the beginning in the previous video, we discussed how it was a time of great military build-up for Germany, but this was kind of like a buffer for that and to prevent that from happening. So the German army was restricted to 100,000 soldiers. They could not import or export weapons. They could not have tanks, armed aircrafts, or poison gas. The navy was limited to 15,000 men and really few ships. So this kind of shows how unfair the treaty was for Germany, because this is hampering the military build-up, and this is what led to this was actually what was defied in the beginning of World War II. Along with territory, there was also Rhineland, the occupation of Rhineland, and this is what I'm mentioning separately, because this was quite important, because it plays a major role in the beginning of World War II. But basically what happened is Rhineland, which is here, the Treaty of Versailles said that Rhineland would be occupied by Allied troops for 15 years. Basically, it was a demilitarized zone, and it was a way for the entente to keep an eye on Germany and make sure they do not defy the Treaty of Versailles, although they clearly didn't do that and weren't successful. Another major term of the Treaty of Versailles, let's just give this another page actually, was what was known as the League of Nations. The League of Nations. Now, this was one of the very first international organization created to maintain peace, so they could prevent a war in the future. And it was a hope that something good would come out from the worst war in human history so far. And 25 million people had died, entire nations were weakened, and for what? So Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of the USA, just write that here, Woodrow Wilson, the president of the USA, came up with the idea of the League of Nations during creating the Treaty of Versailles. So the League of Nations were made up, it had a General Assembly, kind of like the current UN. The General Assembly had all the member states, and along with that, it had an Executive Council, which was what our Security Council is, kind of like in the UN today. And the Executive Council again was made up of 4 major nations, which was the Big Four, as in you had Great Britain. Let's just write UK there. You had UK, you had Italy, France, and USA. Now, the problems of this was that firstly, USSR was technically supposed to be a part of this Executive Council and a part of the League of Nations. However, they weren't allowed to do so because they had turned communist by this time. In one of the previous videos, we've discussed about the Russian Empire and the revolution, so you can have a look at that for that. However, so they turned communist, and USSR was not allowed to take part in the League, and Germany was not allowed to take part either because they had to take all of the reparations, and they had to accept responsibility for the war guilt clause, so no one allowed Germany into the League of Nations. And lastly, USA actually did not take part in the League of Nations. So USA did not take part. Woodrow Wilson, once he went back to USA, was told by the Congress to obviously withdraw, because they had a policy of nations donating money to help the weaker countries develop and build up again after the war, and the Congress did not support or like this, so USA got out, which basically left them with really weak countries. The UK was the only major force over here. France was too weakened to do anything. And secondly, the League of Nations did not have an army, so there was no one enforcing the laws. And it was the failure of the League of Nations combined with the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles that led to World War II, that led to Hitler coming up to power and defying all the norms.